Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Indian Business and Professional Council, Dubai. Now, may I invite Mr. Dilip Sinha, Coordinator General of IBPC, for the welcome remarks. Thank you.
Salam alaikum, good evening and namaste, distinguished guests and IBPC members. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Bibek Debroy to this evening session on India-UAE dialogue. He is the chairman of Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India. Besides that, he is an eminent economist, bureaucrat, and author par excellence, which you will see in a few minutes in a short video. I also take this opportunity to welcome His Excellency Abdullah Al Saleh, Under Secretary for Foreign Trade, Ministry of Economy. Thank you for coming. I would also like to welcome Mr. Ali Ibrahim, Deputy Director General, Dubai Economy Department. Thank you, sir, for coming here. As we know, with the growing Indo-UAE cooperation and friendship, India-UAE dialogue becomes ever more important. IBPC, as all you know, is a bridge. It acts as a bridge between UAE and India business communities. I'm quite sure that you will enjoy today evening's dialogue and the words that are spoken, which will not only develop our knowledge further, but also give us creative ideas. Where do we invest? Which are the sectors where we can invest in India, or also about the current economic environment, and go richer this evening. While you are going to enjoy that, I'm sure my long speech is not required. I would request CB to play a small video before I invite the distinguished guest onto the podium. With that, I would like to invite our distinguished guest, Dr. Bibek Debroy, and the chairman of IBPC, Mr. Suresh Kumar, onto the stage to conduct the rest of the evening. Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies.
Let me simply call you Bibek Da, or Bibek for short, and plunge straight into the dialogue. It'll give us a little bit more time for the audience as well to ask you questions at the end of it. So I'll start with my first question, or a subset of a few questions. The more recent debate, especially in the economic media in India and across investor bases around the world, is the idea that it's not just an idea. The announced aspirational agenda of India becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25 which is also the term when Mr. Modi's second term ends. My question is not so much as if, but when. Because I have no doubt in my mind that India will become a $5 trillion economy. But the target dates of 2024 and 25 seems on the face of it a little ambitious. So it's not if, but when. So my first question is, did some homework, did some planning go into that announcement? It's a matter of credibility as well for the Prime Minister when he makes an announcement, because he sets the agenda for the nation. So what kind of homework, etc.? Because as Geeta Gopinath, the IMF chief economist, said, this would imply that India has to grow at the rate of 10.5% in US dollar terms, nominal GDP, and 8.5% in terms of real GDP, which is a tall order from where we are today, particularly given the last few quarters of falling GDP numbers. So my first question is that. My sub-question from that is, India is a union of states, as you have been saying very frequently. And therefore, a lot of this growth has to come from the various states and provinces, union territories in India. How much of cooperative federalism, or how much of a framework is this going to be created? I'll just give you, as a digression, an example from here. In the UAE, which is also a federation, when targets are set, there is fairly detailed study and work behind it, and then it is adopted by UAE Inc. or Dubai Inc., as it were, in each case. So it's measurable, it's justifiable, and it stands up to scrutiny. So have the states been taken into confidence? Is there a plan for an economic council, a national economic council similar to the GST council, where all the states can get together and each one can play the ball to make sure, because each of them have to grow. Some of them, particularly the eastern states in India, have to grow much faster than they've been growing. So these are my first two questions, as it were.
Thank you, and let me first thank IBPC and Dubai for having invited me here and hosted me here. And thank you, Mr. Suresh Kumar, for those questions. You are a formidable questionnaire, because disguised in those ostensibly two questions, there are quite a bundle of questions. So let me start, and if I have not answered a question satisfactorily, please prod me again. $5 trillion 2024-25 is an aspirational target. It's an aspirational target to incentivize the reforms, to trigger the reforms. If I look at a $5 trillion target, it's a function of two things. Firstly, the rate of inflation and the US dollar rupee rate, because after all, it's a target that's expressed in dollars. Whenever an economy does well, the exchange rate of that currency tends to appreciate. 2024-25 is too soon for the rupee to appreciate significantly vis-a-vis the dollar, but as a long-term trend, it should appreciate, and the exchange rate is determined by supply and demand of dollars. I'm using dollars as an example. From the competitiveness point of view of India's exports of goods and services, you'd want the rupee to depreciate, but the capital inflows lead to pressures for appreciation. But anyway, so whenever you are trying to compute what it takes to reach that target of 5 trillion US dollars, you will have to make some assumptions about the rate of inflation, because it's a nominal target, and you will have to make some assumptions about the way the exchange rate behaves. Depending on the assumptions you make, you can arrive at a growth rate of around 8% or thereabouts in real terms. As I said, you can sit down with your mobiles or laptops or iPads and have alternative assumptions. You'll come up with a different real rate of growth, but roughly, let's say, real rate of growth of 8%. When one is talking about attaining that real rate of growth of 8%, there was a period in the past when India grew at 9% and more for 4 years consecutively. But that was a period when the external world was somewhat kinder. Today in the external world, there is a lot of uncertainty. Therefore, to drive that 8% rate of growth, fundamentally one has to look at endogenous sources of growth. And there have been indeed studies that have been done to show that there is enough slack, there are enough endogenous sources of growth within India to ensure that rate of growth of 8% or thereabouts, that real rate of growth. You're absolutely right that an all-India rate of growth is fundamentally a function of what is happening at the level of states. 90 to 95% of national income, depending on the year, happens in states. So to get that 8%, you need to ensure that states, as you yourself said, in the eastern parts grow faster. Because if some states, particularly in the eastern parts, are growing at 6.5%, then you cannot conceivably get that 8% real rate of growth. There is also a debate that happens in India, which you are familiar with, which is about whether the present growth slowdown has been caused by structural elements or demand-driven elements. The structural elements essentially mean reforms of factor markets, primarily land and labor. The sources of growth in different states, of course, are going to be different, but by and large, it requires more efficient land markets, more efficient labor markets, and of course, more efficient capital markets, and the rest is productivity. There are already initiatives, and initiatives always will have to be incremental. There are already initiatives for gradually introducing reforms in land markets and labor markets. I don't think one should read too much into what has happened or is likely to happen this particular year. This particular year, India will probably end up growing at about 5% because there were some shocks to the system. Next year, we should be back at 6 to 6.5. So another way of answering a question is there enough momentum to break that linear trend and get away from 6 to 6.5 to 8% or thereabouts? The last bit of the question is, have the states been consulted? The GST Council is a phenomenal example of successful decision making, forget the nitty-gritty of the GST, between the union government and the states. The corresponding part now is the Governing Council meeting of Niti Aayog. At the Governing Council meeting of Niti Aayog, these targets were discussed, they will continue to be discussed, and it is Niti Aayog's mandate to have this dialogue with the states so that the required reforms happen.
You know, economists around the world and investors and intelligentsia and English-speaking intelligentsia in particular get very excited about GDP numbers and data relating to GDP. If you look at it from a social economist perspective or any other perspective, it's the quality of growth that is equally important. And the growth has been uneven. You've had growing disparities. The disparities have widened from the time we remember them being measured in any manner or shape in India. So my question is really, when it comes to allocation of resources, as each government faces, you've got the broader allocation of resources in terms of the finance commissions at the center, the 15th Finance Commission and the state finance commissions, but specific fiscal measures. Arguably, for instance, the recent giveaway, which I'm sure all the corporates, etc., here would appreciate, the giveaway in terms of reducing the corporate tax rate to 15% or 17%, as it were, is a gift that the corporate sector did not quite expect. I mean, they might have wanted it, but did not quite expect to happen sooner. And whether, arguably, it was, other than being greeted by the stock market run-up for a few days, the corporate sector has gone back to saying we need more specific, sector-specific concessions and the like. So recently, the Nobel Prize winners this year, both Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, when asked, said that it might have been better if the government had applied that money towards the bottom of the pyramid and, reduced disparities, given farm support, rural support, etc. What's your take on it? You're from the governing side of the equation.
Well, my first comment would be that the policies of the second Narendra Modi government are a continuation of the policies of the first Narendra Modi government. And the policies of the third Narendra Modi government will also be a continuation of the policies of the first and the second Narendra Modi government. And one of the initiatives of the Narendra Modi government has been to address the bottom of the pyramid. There are 600,000 villages in India. 100,000 of those villages, until recently, lacked several of the things that we take for granted. Whether it is the all-weather roads, whether it is the LPG connection, whether it is the toilet, whether it is the sanitation, whether it is the electricity connection, whether it is medical insurance. And one of the unappreciated initiatives has been to deliver all of these. One of the unappreciated initiatives has been to deliver transport connectivity in parts of India where 7 decades after independence you still did not have a railway connection in your state, you still did not have an airport in your state. The impact of these things, of course, are social empowerment. The impact of these things in terms of their contribution to productivity are difficult to quantify, but they come. So if a woman does not have to trudge to get water, does not have to trudge 10 kilometers to get firewood, these have tangible gains in terms of productivity. The fact that these dashboards show that these things have happened, the fact that these dashboards show that 99% of Indian households now have bank accounts, eventually they will begin to use those bank accounts. They are not yet using those bank accounts adequately. These will lead to productivity gains. So far as inequality, so this is, to my mind, the best way of interpreting inclusion. And mind you, this is the first time there is decentralized identification of beneficiaries under something called SECC. So across union government programs, state government programs, the SECC, which is a decentralized census, is used to decide who should be the beneficiary of a subsidy, and that's linked to bank accounts, linked to the Aadhaar accounts. The next issue that arises is the issue of inequality. On the issue of inequality, one has to be a little bit careful. Typically, one thinks of inequality in terms of the distribution of incomes. Income data, India does not have very reliable data on incomes, but doesn't matter. We have reliable data on consumption expenditure. Doesn't matter, but I'm going to make a point. I said India used to have 600,000 villages. About 125,000 of those villages were already integrated into the mainstream. I don't know how many of you know that there are 237 villages inside Delhi. The fact that they are villages is neither here nor there. They have no differences from urban areas, but nonetheless. One of the things that's happened because of the initiatives I have mentioned is another 200,000 odd villages which have population sizes more than 5,000 have become integrated into the mainstream. There are still villages in India which have population sizes less than 500, less than 200. Integrating them is much more difficult. In other words, the point I'm making is, if you imagine a radius of development, the radius has gradually expanded. In the process, the so-called inequality between the village which has a population size of 200 and a village which has a population size of 5,000 has increased. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so, because as I said, the radius is expanding. We now come to the union government's finances. The devolution in the constitutionally, the devolution fundamentally happens through recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. The 14th Finance Commission recommended that the share to states of the divisible pool of taxes should increase from 32% to 42%, which means this 42% they can spend on whatever they want. Another 20-odd% is through these union government schemes that I mentioned, whether it is health, whether it is food, whether it is something else. So about 63% of public expenditure happens at the level of the states. Managing the finances, therefore, at the union government level is somewhat messy, particularly because in the short run, many of the expenditure items, they are fixed in the short run. Salaries, pensions, interest payments, things like those. So far as the corporate tax rate cut is concerned, when it was first announced in a speech delivered by the then Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, in the same sentence, not a different sentence, separated by a comma, he said, the reduction in corporate tax rates has to be linked with removal of exemptions. Exemptions together amount to 5 to 5.5% of GDP. Lost revenue foregone. Quite apart from the fact that in India, at least, the exemptions enrich the chartered accountants. No disrespect to the chartered accountants who are here. What was done was, you can avail of the lower corporate tax rate if you give up exemptions. Indian industry, perhaps like industry everywhere else, argues, remove the exemptions for everyone else, retain them from me. That does not simplify the tax system. And the reason they are not excited is they've figured out that, depending on the company, with the exemptions, the corporate tax rate, the effective corporate tax rate was already sufficiently low, and therefore there isn't that much of excitement about the 18%. The 15% is for new companies. Exactly similarly, on the personal income tax side, if and when it happens, it's not a question of if, when it happens, I am reasonably certain it will be linked to removal of exemptions, and you are given the choice. Do you want the old system with exemptions, or do you want a new one where you give up all exemptions and have a lower rate?
Vivek, one of the defining features, or a few of the defining features of Mr. Modi's first term as a Prime Minister were both initiatives like Swachh Bharat, essentially physical cleanliness, hygiene, and more significantly, a cleanup of the economy, some of the old ways of doing business, some of the distortions, some of the less than ethical ways of doing business, accounting them, and compliance with tax and everything else. Now, both these received body blows in a manner of speaking by these initiatives, because what it meant was that you had to make a departure from the way you lived. You were given facilities if you did that. And so these initiatives, particularly the economic initiatives, had a certain price, certain consequences, which arguably we are witnessing now in terms of low growth rates, because the transition from informal to formal economy was not smooth. Not expected to be smooth. Similarly, each one of these meant that there is considerable deleveraging that happened and continuing to happen on the corporate balance sheets, on the business balance sheets across. So is that a reasonable explanation for the falling growth, and then this will strengthen the core economy, and therefore from there it'll start to pick up and you will see some green shoots and the economy going forward from here looking better? Or is there still more pain to come, as it were?
Broadly speaking, I agree with you. There are several initiatives that are designed to ensure the cleaning up. The GST itself is an example of that. If the competitiveness is based on not paying taxes, even if those taxes need to be paid, then obviously that competitiveness will be under threat. And GST, there is of course a threshold. GST is bringing more and more players into the net. If the real estate sector has been informal, has been characterized by a lot of cash and illegally obtained money. I'm not equating cash and illegally obtained. Illegally obtained means that there's been some illegality about that source of income. If that is going to be cleaned up through RERA, then of course there's going to be a cost. If shell companies, if 200,000 shell companies are going to be closed down, 16,000 of which operated out of one single post box in Barabazar in Kolkata, then obviously there will be costs. So there are these costs, and I can go on and on about these costs, which are meant to clean up the system.
And the insolvency bankruptcy.
And the IBC, the insolvency code, because competition requires not just free entry, it requires exit also. And promoters have been somewhat reluctant to exit. It's the first time that, thanks to the IBC, promoters are exiting. Quickly on the IBC, I should also say this is not just about corporated enterprise, because a large number of enterprises in India are not in the corporate form. And until the IBC, they did not have satisfactory exit provisions. So when the enterprise failed, not only was the enterprise punished, the entrepreneur was also punished. Now that's not a very tenable way of doing business. As the Economic Advisory Council, we also do some amount of tracking of the economy in terms of indicators. And I am sort of divulging a secret, but it is no great secret. In terms of the tracking that we do, the worst was the month of September. And since November, things have begun to improve. Now, don't get me wrong. I said in the month of November, so it's not yet robust enough. But since the month of November, the indicators show an improvement. By the way, whenever one is looking at the figures, one should not get swayed by the quarterly figures, because the quarterly figures are all estimates. One should wait till the end of the year. End of the year, I already said, I think we're going to do 5%. But the worst being over means that next year onwards, I think we will be 6% and upwards. This kind of shock, I think the worst of that is over. Obviously, for something like real estate, it will linger. For something like the financial sector, it will linger. So let me add one additional point. I can have a whole list of reforms necessary in the financial sector, but in some sense, the financial sector's growth rate has to be in tandem with what is happening in the real sector. And what has happened over the last 15 years or 20 years is a disproportionately high growth in the financial sector, quite disproportionate compared to what the real sector was doing. And therefore, it's sort of a linked point, but nonetheless, I thought I should flag it differently. There is now a reality check for the financial sector.
Picking up from one of the comments you made about the need for, from an exchange rate perspective, but in a different context, for India to have, one of the figures that was mentioned a few years back is $5 trillion of infrastructure spend that might be needed over the next 5-10 years. Now, I'm not sure about these numbers, but the scale of what is required in terms of investments in the infrastructure sectors, across the infrastructure sectors, is quite a significant amount. Despite a healthy savings rate, this requires at least 1/4 of them by way of equity inflows, whether equity inflows domestically, which doesn't seem likely to be generated to that extent, but more importantly, foreign direct investments that would come in. Now, this is very important for India, and one that the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, when he visited the UAE first, after 40 years before a Prime Minister in 2015, agreed that there would be up to $75 billion of investment flows that will be committed from the UAE in one form or another. And some of it has already started. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority is a large investor in the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, is an anchor investor. And also across several sectors, they have been investing for a number of years. The DP World, which is a Dubai-based group, internationally listed, has also done a joint venture in the logistics storage space, cold storage space. Now, these are significant investments which are equity inflows, foreign direct investment inflows, not debt, but equity inflows into India. Most investors globally, whether it is NRIs or whether it is institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, look for stable exchange rates, predictable, stable, reasonably predictable, stable exchange rates. And there, the Indian track record has not been brilliant. Going forward, given that this is a very large stakeholder segment, would the government view this aspect differently?
Look, I'm an economist. Economists are very bad at predicting how exchange rates move. They are very good at predicting how exchange rates have moved in the past, not in the future. Had I known how exchange rates behave in the future, I would have probably sought for a job in Dubai and not become an economist. Having said that, exchange rates are not always about the US dollar vis-a-vis the rupee, although that's the normal one that one uses, as I mentioned earlier. It's about the exchange rate vis-a-vis other competitive currencies. The exchange rate is market determined, although it is still subject to a lot of central bank intervention. Central bank intervention in either direction to stem the appreciation or to stem the depreciation has costs. Ideally, one should not try to buck a secular trend, but should try to cushion the volatility, which is precisely what a central bank does, what the RBI also does, except de facto sometimes it is very difficult to differentiate a volatility from a secular trend. Now, so therefore the exchange rate policy is, the actual band is never announced by the RBI. It is desirable it should not announce it, but the general policy is, here is a band. If it crosses the band in either direction, I will intervene, because after all, India does not want to be accused of currency manipulation either. On the infrastructure part of it, infrastructure is a complicated business, and I completely agree that most of the infrastructure development that has so far happened has been credit driven. We haven't had much of equity and even bonds. Infrastructure is a complicated business because depending on the infrastructure, it can sometimes be a union government subject, it can sometimes be on the concurrent list, it might sometimes be a state government subject. The union government is putting in a lot of money into national highways and also into railways and of course parts of civil aviation, airports, and now beginning to put in some money in waterways and seaports. The problem with the infrastructure sector is there's a bit of a legacy issue because infrastructure typically requires land. And there have been problems with land acquisition, there have been problems with environmental clearances, there have been problems with forest clearances, and sometimes there's also been the National Green Tribunal coming in. In addition, we are still in the process of evolving a regulatory structure for the infrastructure sector, railways being a case in point. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is infrastructure reforms will not be one where suddenly at the drop of a hat you will have a spectacular improvement. NIIF is a very good initiative. Sooner rather than later, it will begin to invest in projects. And the private sector initiatives or the inflows often require a regulator which ensures the stability of policies. By the way, the taxation regime is also part of that. And also quite often public investments are required as a catalyst to trigger those private investments.
You mentioned the Indian Railways. You chaired a committee and it has given a report to the government with some significant, impactful recommendations, whether it is commercial accounting, whether it is with regard to the HR and organization structure. And more importantly, you have said that the social costs should be identified and hopefully reimbursed by the government to railways, with the railways being run as a commercial enterprise, albeit with the social costs being reimbursed. Some strong, good recommendation. I mean, considering the Indian Railways is the largest enterprise in India by some measurements. How far is that progressing? will that create investable opportunities for overseas investors, particularly institutional investors? Because a lot of these in India are socially impactful investments. So there are a number of social impact funds around the world that are looking for investments that will produce a positive commercial return and yet creates positive social impact. Besides, you also have a number of pension funds and long-term patient capital, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, who would want. Indian Railways clearly has the capability to generate cash flows, both on the passenger side and in terms of freight traffic. So, can you share with us some thoughts, how things are progressing? What can we see and expect from there?
I have a series of responses. As you yourself said, Indian Railways represent one of India's largest employers. If one is looking for a segment where the railways interfaces with the citizen, or sector where there is an interface with the citizen almost on a day-to-day basis, it is the railways. And by the way, just to state a figure which may or may not be familiar with you, that 95% of passengers in India who travel on the railways still travel unreserved. So the bullet train, the Shatabdi and the Rajdhani, these things impact a very small segment of the population, purely in terms of passengers. In terms of responses, the reforms are footing along. I felt like saying inching along, but if I said inching along, it would suggest nothing very much is happening. So I said footing along. We recommended private entry. Now that policy change has already happened, and when I say this, I don't mean just services offered on trains, because those are already private, or washing and cleaning of stations, those are also private. But technically, you are entitled to run a private train in India. Not just goods, but also passenger. And you will have noticed from the newspapers that the first passenger train has already started. It's private in the sense that it is a pilot thing which is being run by IRCTC, but it's de-linked from the conventional Indian Railways. The second part was commercial accounting. Commercial accounting has been done on a pilot basis successfully in the Ajmer division of the Indian Railways, and now extended all the way into the Northern Railway, the entire zone. And it is waiting for a rollout across Indian Railways as a whole. Until that is done, until you have a complete transition to commercial accounting, you don't really have a credible figure on what the social costs are. Nor do you have a credible figure on what the average rate of return, and all average rates of return are very, very misleading. It's an average. So you catch hold of me, put one of my feet inside a fridge and the other one inside an oven, on an average I will be very comfortable. But the average rate of return on Indian Railways is about 6%. That does not mean it's for all projects. The third thing is the regulator. The regulator is still awaited because there's some debate going on about whether the regulator should be set up executively or should be set up statutorily. There are pros and cons on either side, but once the regulator is set up, you will have independent fixation of tariffs, both on the passenger side and on the freight side. A substantive recommendation which we suggested as a terminal goal, not immediately because it is required eventually, not right now, is to de-link the role of Indian Railways as a policy setter, the Ministry of Railways, the railway board, which should be the corporate kind of board of the public service railway provider, and to have a separate railway infrastructure corporation to look after the tracks and etc., etc. That's in the works. We recommended a decentralization of decision making. A substantive bit of that has already been done. And finally, we recommended that the railway services should be unified and you should break down those silos. This is easier said than done. So that is a heated issue because so many people work for the railways. So amongst the items I have listed, this is the one which is probably the least successful so far. However, from the investment point of view, there are about 20 railway stations which are now being developed through the private sector. You will see the first of these, the first 4 or 5 of these in 2020. Because if it is the private sector which is coming in, you need land that you can use for developing commercial real estate. And contrary to the impression that the Indian Railways has a lot of land, the land that can be actually used for stations is very limited. There has also been an opening up of locomotive production. There was already an opening up of wagon production. And also what is being opened up is things like telecom, software, etc., connected with the railways. So I would say that there are some segments of the railways where there is plenty of scope for foreign participation.
No, that's good to hear because I think railways is an investable proposition by any means. Moving on to your personal passion, preferences, you're not just an eminent erudite economist, but also a spiritual scholar. You have translated prodigiously the Bhagavad Gita, and now you're working on some of the Puranas and the like. In all these, what fascinated me was there is a significant element, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita or in the Mahabharata, the issues of governance, the issue of what the ruler, what the government of the day should provide, compliance, good conduct, ethical behavior, Arthashastra, the way business ought to be done. So share with us some insights in this context.
The UN has a figure on how many books have been published in any language in the world since the beginning of printing, since Gutenberg's Bible. And that figure is about 140 million. In India, we have something called the National Manuscript Mission known as Namami. Namami's job is to list, initially just list, how many manuscripts exist in India, both in private collections as well as public collections. Eventually it will become digitization, but at the moment just list. Today, Namami so far has been able to list about 3.5 million manuscripts. Namami's estimates are there are 40 million manuscripts in India. A manuscript being defined as something that is typically not written on paper and something that is at least 75 years old. The point is, so you've got 40 million, you've got 140 million. The point being that 95% of these manuscripts have still not been translated. So there's a wealth of treasure, and we simply don't know what is in that. To give one example, I have a 13th century text called Chaurya Shastram. As the name suggests, those of you who know Hindi or any Indian language or Sanskrit, Chaurya Shastram is a manual for thieves. If I were to translate it, it would become a 400-page. It's not about auditors, it was about thieves then. So I decided to translate some of these which have never been translated. You mentioned Arthashastra. If I asked some of you that give me an example of an ancient text that talks about governance and political economy, you would invariably say Arthashastra. However, until Shama Shastri discovered the Arthashastra manuscript in 1905 and translated it, Arthashastra had disappeared. There were references to it, no one knew where it was. There is plenty of material in these texts on what is called governance. In terms of a governance template, there was a clear role for what the king should do, Raja Dharma. And the king did very limited things. The king's job, the counterpart of the government today, was ensure dispute resolution, defense and external security, internal security, ensure speedy dispute resolution, protect property rights, punish the wicked, and protect the virtuous. And that is it. And the tax GDP ratio then was 16% of GDP. Today also it's 16% of GDP. Exactly the same, but we expected much less on the part of the government.
We are looking at 1300 BC.
We are looking at, well, maybe a bit later. A bit later, but doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Today, as a citizen of India, I expect everything from the government. And quite often the government steps in because we as citizens are abdicating our responsibility. In that day and age, there was no Competition Commission of India to discipline unfair trade practices and the restrictive business practices. The Srenis, to translate into English, the guilds did that. Skill development was done by the guilds. MRP was implemented by the guilds. The point I'm making is there was a whole lot that the community did. And you don't have to go back thousands of years. If you read the district gazetteers that the British composed, you will find that till the 19th century, all of this survived. To give one example, 1883, the Ambala District Gazetteer. What's happening in Ambala? In Ambala in the year 1883, a canal is going to be built. How much is that canal going to cost? In 1883 rupees, roughly 45,000 rupees. The government of the day paid 20,000. Who paid the remaining 25,000? The community did. And there was the role of the individual. So in terms of that template, there was a role for the government, there was a role for the community, there was the role for the individual, which somehow or the other we seem to have forgotten. Now let me give you two illustrations. And both of these illustrations, no, I shall tell you later where these illustrations are from. These are the 17 most important cases, civil cases, that you should try in order of priority. 17 most important civil cases that you should try in order of priority, and number one was breach of contract. Who said this? Not the people from Chicago or the World Bank. This is Bhishma in the Mahabharata when he was lying down on the bed of arrows and instructing Yudhishthira on the king's duties. A rich person should never, guilty of a crime, should never be imprisoned. Because if you imprison a rich person guilty of a crime, that is at the cost of the public exchequer. So only the relatively poor person who cannot pay the monetary penalty should be imprisoned. You may disagree with the value judgment, but it has a certain impeccable logic of its own, which the law and economic guys from Chicago would love. Who said this again? Bhishma. So there's a wealth of material on governance, which primarily, because it's not been translated, or the Sanskrit Pandits know it, the English-speaking people don't know it, it's not been used.
You very seamlessly migrate from economics to spirituality. And I understand that you started learning Sanskrit at the age of 40. So it's a phenomenal achievement. So tell us, from a personal perspective, do you still find time? Because you've written phenomenal number of books, translations. How do you manage to, you know, juggle the two priorities, professional and personal?
I wish I could give a very satisfactory answer to that, because it's really a question of time management. And since I began to work for the government, it has become a little bit more difficult. So when I'm back early from office, 7 to 8:30 is my time for this, otherwise Sundays. So therefore, if you rarely see me on pointless TV debates, that's because this is what I am doing. And all dinners and things like that, if you ever invite me to dinner in Delhi or elsewhere, it will be after 8:30, not before that. So 7 to 8:30 typically, unless there are meetings, is this translation time, and Sundays.
It's good to hear. I think time management is something important for all our members, so I'm sure it's music to their ears. Now I'll move to questions from the audience. There have been a couple of questions that were emailed to us this morning, so I'll start with that. The first one you may have answered earlier, but it's from Mr. Naveen Kapoor. Is he here? Yeah, a veteran member of IVPC who has held a number of positions building up this organization in the past. His question is, and he used to work for, in a senior capacity, he used to manage a crystal gallery, right, sometime back. So he's asking you to look at the crystal ball and say, is the GDP growth bottoming out likely to be over soon, or is there more pain in the offing?
When I look at headline GDP numbers, the headline GDP numbers are numbers that are coming with a time lag. So I said that since November, it is beginning to improve. So the bottoming out has happened. But the next quarter's figures, which will come with a time lag, will not necessarily be very good because of the time lag factor. So beginning with Q4 of this year, you will actually see the headline number changing. Although, as I said, I think the bottoming out has already happened.
The second question is a little more complicated, certainly in my view. Mr. Kesar Kotari, is he in the audience? Anyway, he's from the Rajasthan Businessmen Association as well. He's the chairman. How can Indian economy become world-class until the government stop patronizing free doles to farmers and stop the policy of reservation in jobs and education, and instead of free education to the needy and strict observance of merit in jobs and education? It's a little out-of-the-box question.
It's not quite an out-of-the-box question. You see, some things have to be decided by a democracy through democratic processes. The reservation issue is an issue that needs to be addressed by Parliament through constitutional means. And when Parliament or the government reacts to something, it is always, more often than not, it's a reflection of the pressure that citizens bring to bear. So that's on that part. On the second part, as I said, this government has been moving away towards identifying beneficiaries through decentralized identification instead of across-the-board identification. So therefore, doles, for want of a better word, I'm using the word doles since the word doles is there, Doles will increasingly be direct benefit transfers. I mentioned that it's begun to happen for some of the, and remember, some of agriculture is on the state list. If we are against doles to farmers, logically we should also be against doles to privileged people like ourselves, some of whose sons and daughters, not present companies, some of whose sons and daughters study in public institutions of higher education where the fees have not been changed for 4 decades. Those are also doles. When I am giving, I mentioned the revenue foregone. Those are doles also to the corporate sector and the unincorporated sector. So if we are going to be consistent in our position about doles, we should be across all forms of doles. I cannot be selective and say, this reflects what I said earlier, leave my exemptions intact, take away the exemption for others. So the logical argument would be to remove all subsidies, consumption as well as production, that are not targeted on the basis of decentralized identification of deprivation, which is what the SECC does.
Is that means testing by which very broadly?
It is very broadly, but it is not means testing in terms of income, because income data are very unreliable. So what it has is, it has a whole list of deprivation indicators, things like, do you have a pakka house? Do you have tap water? Those kinds of things. It's really assets and amenities, not so far, not income.
We didn't give enough time to our members to ask questions ahead of time. If you agree, we'll take a few questions from the
sure.
audience.
Hi, that was very insightful. I have a couple, just a question, with the US and China trade situation being what it is, and with our Make in India initiative, what do you think that the government of India can do more or is already doing to attract more foreign investment to come into India? Because there's a lot of money that obviously needs a home. What do you think that the opportunity for India could be in the next 5 years?
Again, I'll give my response in 2 different ways. It is undesirable that there should be preferential treatment to foreign investors. So when the investment climate is being improved, it is being improved for everyone. That is being done through the doing business initiatives. I don't mean the World Bank's doing business indicators, which have a limited sample survey, but DIPP's initiative of improving business. As a result of that, several states have improved, and you can actually see the visible improvements. You still have problems with land acquisition, environment, forest, the kind of things I mentioned. FDI figures are quite impressive. It's a different matter that most of FDI has come into mergers, in the form of mergers and takeovers, not really greenfield. But the greenfield FDI has begun to happen in some segments. The other bit of it is a trade issue. Now, so far as the trade issue is concerned, all along India has said and continues to say that the multilateral system is preferable. Unfortunately, the multilateral system is in a bit of a limbo right now. Indian government, as in the Commerce Ministry, has inherited a plethora of regional trade agreements. There are so many regional trade agreements that all effective rates of protection are completely warped. So one needs to take a relook at all of this to ensure that one has to have a coherent policy around trade. And trade, I'm focusing on trade because trade is linked to investment. You cannot have one without the other. quite clearly there are certain areas that are of particular interest to India. One is Southeast Asia. Second one is North America. Third one is Europe. And this is not in the order of priority. And of course, fourth is this particular region. So these regions will be regions where, without violating the most favored nation clause or without violating national treatment, will be focus areas for negotiations.
This is Arvind Raghav. I'm from Dun & Bradstreet. Sir, my question is, you mentioned Modi 2 to Modi 3, and we could see the entire hall clapping. I have traveled to the Hindi heartland. I've traveled to Aligarh, Moradabad, etc. during the election time, and all the things that you mentioned were very clearly visible. So it was visible how this 282 became 353 for NDA, with the Ujjwala, with all the toilets, etc. My question is, when India has a very short memory when it comes for, voting. Now, most of these things, which were major game changers for the country, especially in the social scenario, socio-economic scenario, I think most of these have already been done. So what are, I was listening to Mr. Amit Shah yesterday in the India Today conclave, and he mentioned that, there was a question that, whatever you do is to do with politics. He said if that was so, then all these things that are happening now would have happened in 2023. But so, 2024, what are these specific changes that you think would, make this Modi 3 possible?
By the way, as public disclosure, I have known this gentleman for several years and trust him to ask an embarrassing question that I should duck. In other words, 2024 is some distance away. So there is no need for anyone to pre-announce what is likely to happen in 2023. Rest assured there will be something or the other. For most people that will be a pleasant surprise. For some, of course, it will be an unpleasant surprise.
This is Rajesh Agarwal. You talked about translating Chaurya Shastra. In 2-3 minutes, can you just tell us what was Chaurya Shastra? Because I know that nobody knows about it. Thank you. Where can we buy? Somebody's asking where we can buy. I don't know.
As I said, it's a manual for thieves. And remember, in those days, houses were not exactly constructed the way they are constructed today. So it had all kinds of things. How do you avoid the watchman? How do you avoid the guard dogs? How do you drill a hole in the wall to get inside? How do you smear your body with oil? How do you sell the things they have stolen? So a whole lot of things. Wait for the translation.